And now it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, the second in our series on the humanitarian crisis in Cuba. This series is intended to bring voices from inside Cuba and from a broader international perspective. And today's conversation will focus on what the Cuban private sector is and its capacity to help alleviate the crises. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we've got from Havana, Marta Deus, CEO of Mandao. We've got Mark Entwistle, a former Canadian ambassador to Cuba, among other places, and he's based in Toronto. And Ricardo Herrero, executive director of the Cuba Study Group. He's based in Washington. With that, it is a pleasure to hand it over to today's moderator, the president of the CCA, Ken Frankel. Ken?
Thank you, Marta, and thank you all for listening today. Good morning to those in this hemisphere, and good afternoon to our loyal listeners in Europe. This is a continuation, as Marta said, of a conversation we started several weeks ago on the humanitarian crisis in Cuba. As all of you who have been following the news a little bit, even a little bit, would know that every day there seems to be new developments or conversations about potential new developments into what's going on in Cuba. I think the read of John Lee Anderson's piece in the New Yorker in the last few days has also heightened the interest and the knowledge a bit of the conditions on the ground in Cuba and what may be coming ahead, although that's very unclear at this point. But at this point, we want to just go back a bit, or at least update, I think is a better word, of what are the conditions on the ground in Cuba today, particularly with respect to the humanitarian conditions and the crisis. And so to start us off, I would turn to Rick and ask if you could please chat a little bit about that.
Sure thing, and thank you for having me here this morning. Cuba today is not experiencing a humanitarian crisis in the acute emergency sense, due to a climate disaster or catastrophe or something of the sort. Instead, it's something much more insidious. It's a slow motion, multi-dimensional collapse, or what some folks would refer to as a polycrisis, that is grinding down the population's basic quality of life. And this collapse has really no end in sight. The energy crisis is a defining feature of this collapse. You have Cuba, which is a country that normally needs just upwards of 3,000 megawatts of electricity to run its basic demands. They're experiencing power deficits that exceed 2,000 megawatts nationally. So from 3,000, they're losing 2,000 nationally. So this leads to constant nationwide blackouts. We just saw 2 nationwide blackouts in just the last 10 days. In some provinces, these blackouts run 16 to 20 hours a day. Sometimes they run 2 to 3 days in a row, and then they'll have an hour or two of electricity before the next blackout hits. You have to take advantage of that time to cook, to power your cell phones, anything else that you need that you can't power through a solar panel or a generator. Should you be so lucky to have those items. But it just grinds productivity and just society to a halt. More than 60% of the installed generation capacity in Cuba, meaning the electric grid, which runs on thermoelectric power plants, more than 60% of that capacity is effectively non-operational. It's because it's largely due to equipment that hasn't been maintained, that is largely obsolete. Also fuel that isn't arriving anymore because Cuba was highly dependent on subsidies from Venezuela to meet its energy generation demands. That has stopped arriving. You also have this oil blockade that is keeping other donations of fuel of oil to run the power plants, because it really is donations. Cuba's not really paying for these oil shipments. It's keeping those at bay. So all of this is having real cascading effects. No power means there's no refrigeration, which means food spoils. It means water pumps fail. Hospitals struggle to back up with their backup generators, and all sorts of other medical services don't get done. and really just inflicts a severe psychological toll on a population that's living in semi-permanent darkness. And that toll is hard to overstate. You layer onto that you have GDP that has contracted on the island nearly 11% since 2010. Inflation is running around 30 to 40% nationally, which hits food and the ability to purchase food and other basic goods the hardest. The Cuban peso has collapsed. It's currently trading at around 500 pesos to the dollar, when it used to be pegged at 24 and then 120. And at the street rate right now, it's over 500. Cuba also, over the course of the last 5 years, has lost roughly 2.5 million of its inhabitants, of its citizens who have migrated to the United States and other countries throughout the world. That's roughly around 10 to almost 15% of its population, largely working age Cubans. So you also end up having a severe demographic crisis where it's an island with the oldest population in the entire hemisphere. And what compounds really to this grave situation is that you also have a state apparatus that has essentially lost the capacity to respond to these crises or to even make the very difficult decisions they would have to make in order to correct course. And this is reflected largely also in the views of the people towards the regime, towards the Cuban regime. They Over 90% of the people strongly disapprove of how the government is handling this situation. And the government, in large extent, knows that it has lost much legitimacy with the population and is currently just focused on its own survival, it seems, and not really trying to take the difficult steps to correct this grave situation. I can keep going because
No,
it's
yeah, and
multidimensional, as I mentioned, but I
yeah,
can
no,
stop there as well.
no, you brought in a lot of aspects to it, and thanks, Rick, for that. And you will have opportunity to bring in. We'll revisit those again. Marta, you're on the ground in Havana. What is your sense of the day-to-day situation in terms of the humanitarian needs of the Cuban people?
I will try to open the camera. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly well.
Okay, perfect. Okay,
There you
hello.
go. Perfect.
Yes, since I talk, I will try to open the camera. Well, I spend a lot of time working because I'm not only the co-founder and CEO of Mandao, that is a logistic company, but also I am the founder of a consulting company focused in accounting, and I have also a kind of NGO that supports and promotes private sector, and we do a lot of things. And this week we are organizing a very low profile, but small festival that mix entrepreneurship and jazz. So working in these conditions is really, really hard. I mean, without gasoline or diesel, it's almost impossible for a logistic company. Of course, we deliver food. So, and this problem with the electricity have been happening since a while. I mean, last year, since the middle of the year, it started being more and more critic in Havana. And we have operation in 8 cities in Cuba, and also in the rest of the provinces, it happened much more. I mean, in Havana, we had like blackouts every 3 or 4 hours. They had like maybe 3 or 4 hours a day. So we knew that the situation was were coming to Havana in some point because we didn't have any solution. I mean, the government didn't speak about any solution. So, and with this situation with the of February, so it's even more. So we work in. We deliver in the electric motorcycles, in bicycles. We have been trying to import our own diesel, but it's not not easy, the process. There have been some private companies have done it, but the biggest companies that are distributing in the whole country, that are the ones that have been able to do it. But which is a very good solution and opportunity for them, but also for the people that are living in the provinces, because I was very worried how these people are going to buy food. At least the ones that have families abroad, they can still send in to through these websites, and and then some food are arriving to the provinces. For us, so there are many critical situations. Also, when there are blackouts, we don't have electricity. Of course, we don't have electricity, but also the internet connection is really bad, and we deliver through an app, and right, so the people can connect to the app. There are very, very the orders are very few. Of course, if the internet connections and the blackouts, the restaurants can work, it's almost impossible to connect with the riders that deliver the food. So it's a mix of situations that are really complicated. We have been trying to organize ourselves with the electric vehicles, but also with solar panels. We have been investing in all that things to keep working, and more or less we are trying. We are doing it. What we see, that the most there are many critical things, but what we see that the people is asking more, because we collaborate also with Caritas, with other churches, and some projects, social projects. They ask for basic food like rice and beans and cans of meat or something like that, like some protein, sugar, salt, very basic things, and also medicines. But it's more complicated for us because we're not allowed to deliver medicines. But yes, it's very basic needs, and also we can see it in our app. The kind of products that the people are ordering are very basics. For many years the Cubans sometimes used to order pizza or ropa vieja, but this is not anymore. The people are ordering very basic things to cook in their houses.
Thank you, Marta. Mark, I want to let you talk about that issue as well, but I also want to segue into now essentially the topic of the conversation today, which is the role or the capacity of what's the private sector in Cuba to help alleviate some of the crisis that Rick and Marta just spoke about. And so I invite you to add anything that you want to add to what has just been said, or to take up now the beginning the conversation on explaining a little bit about when we talk about the private sector in Cuba, what are we really talking about, and what kind of activities have they been engaged in, and their capacity to engage, not just and continue to engage in those, but to amplify their efforts to meet more of the humanitarian needs.
Sure, absolutely. I wouldn't suck up any more time, Ken, adding to anything that Rick and Marta said about the situation on the ground. I think they summed up so much of it so eloquently. It is, put simply, a very dire situation for everyday Cubans. There has been a slew of economic difficulties in Cuba for a long time, which we've known about for a whole bunch of reasons. Cuba is a very complicated place. There's all kinds of different factors and reasons for things. I do believe, though, the situation now facing the Cuban people is exponentially worsened since the oil blockade imposed, just because of the importance of fuel. in so many aspects of the economy. But moving on to the private sector, my view, look, the Cuban private sector is real. It was established, by the Cuban state originally. My own view is a number of years ago, it became quite clear to Cuban political leadership that they could not supply lots in an efficient way the goods and services required for the economy. So in bits and pieces, which was a watershed kind of moment, in bits and pieces, it's developed. And it's now quite a vibrant, and Marta is an excellent example of that. It's a vibrant part of the Cuban economy. The Cuban political leadership has recognized it's here to stay. They've recognized its importance. It serves all kinds of functions. It's a motor of employment. There are some estimates, certainly before maybe the stresses of right now, but there have been estimates where upwards of a third of all Cuban, the Cuban labor force is now in the private sector, and this is kind of the classic SME situation. These are genuine private Cuban companies, so there's an active private sector. In terms of the specifics of the humanitarian aid issue, the one thing I would maybe just as a high level comment to set up a discussion with Rick and Marta, I think we have to remember these are private sector companies. This is exactly the kind of company that many people outside of Cuba envisaged as something that would be a good thing to happen in Cuba. These are entrepreneurial, highly entrepreneurial private sector companies. They're not in the job of humanitarian aid. That's not what they do. That's not the fundamental responsibility of a private sector company. They're not NGOs, they're not charitable organizations, but a lot of what they do, and now they're involved in all kinds of things from small manufacturing and food production, transportation, logistics, the kind of work that Marta's doing. This is all related to supplying goods and services to the Cuban people and also providing income to the Cuban people to provide purchasing power to move to buy things that, thanks partly to the private sector, are kind of available. But they are private sector companies. So I think we do have to be slightly cautious in any kind of narrative that presents the private sector as saving the situation or being the motor of humanitarian assistance or aid. They are part of a solution, but they're part of an economy that needs to work at a different level with other parts of the economy. So I'll stop there and just sort of leave it to start.
Thanks, Mark. So, Rick, I saw you shaking your head a bit in the affirmative, not the negative.
It's always better, right, Rick? That way.
We all want validation, Mark, but Rick, so where does the private sector then fit into at least in the short term, to the crisis that's going on? Is it a question of them being, and given what Mark said about what the raison d'etre are for the private sector, what it is and what it isn't, is there capacity for the private sector to scale up to help? Is it a mismatch between their purposes and what they provide and what's required at over the next number of months?
Yeah, I think Mark said it well. The private sector is part of the solution. It's not the solution. It's not the complete solution. We got to be honest about what the private sector can and can't do. I think where the match is strongest for the private sector is in food distribution and in basic commerce. So right now, the private sector is responsible for about 55% of retail sales of consumer goods. That includes the bulk of the food that's being imported into the country. The private sector has really proven itself in this area. They're importing the food, they're running restaurants, they're running small markets, and they have built out alternative supply chains to those that were run by the Cuban government that collapsed during the pandemic. Shortly after the formation of small, medium-sized enterprises was legalized in 2021, you saw private sector actors start building out brand new supply chains across the country to distribute food, not only to import food, and other consumer goods, but importing trucks and in some cases fleets of trucks and opening up distribution centers throughout the island by leasing out state-owned warehouses and other facilities to get food across the island. So in that sense, the private sector has been key. There are also now, thanks to these new authorizations that were put in place, they've also now been handed the entire diesel fuel import market, where you now have U.S. sellers exporting diesel and other fuels like gasoline, but it's mostly diesel that's needed in Cuba. That's what the cars run on. That's what generators run on. That's what water pumps run on. Importing it into the private sector. We saw that Reuters this morning reported that based on their own investigation, at least 30,000 barrels of fuel have made it through the private sector into the country in recent weeks. That is a pathway that has a lot of potential, but a lot of that potential remains largely unrealized. You have these private sector importers still lack basic banking rails in order to be able to pay foreign suppliers, so they always have to come up with some scheme to try to get money to those foreign suppliers. They don't have access to financing, so it's really hard to scale operations. They also have restrictions on the ground. By the way, that lack of access to financing and banking rails, we can put that to a large extent on U.S. policy, even though there are regulations that allow for private sector businesses to open up U.S. bank accounts and access those bank accounts remotely. Because of a lack of regulatory guidance from OFAC and the perceived risk around operating in Cuba, no bank has been willing to step up and start onboarding that sector. That's something we hope will change soon. It's certainly needed, but it is under U.S. regulation, it is authorized, that kind of activity. But by not having access to banking, not having access to financing, you can't scale those operations. On the Cuban side, there's also restrictions as to how you can warehouse that diesel, how you can sell it. Right now, on the Cuban side, you can't sell it to end users. They don't to consumers, as if you were running a gas pump on the street and sell diesel to anybody that drives in. You're seeing, however, that private sector businesses are coming up with creative workarounds with that. They're working with NGOs and other parties on the ground, say the Catholic Church, say other NGOs that are on the ground that are trying to address the humanitarian crisis. They're working out fuel logistics services contracts in which they handle the fuel needs of those NGOs, and thereby they're importing the fuel and providing it to the NGOs so that they can transport food around, get it to warehouse centers, distribute it from there, and so on. Keep the lights on in their own operations. But there are, as you mentioned, Mark, severe mismatches nonetheless. Again, most of this is overwhelmingly services oriented. It's hamstrung in how much this activity can be scaled up due to the regulatory and capital constraints, both on the U.S. and Cuban side. You also have the state-owned, the military's business conglomerate, Gaesa, which has in recent years increasingly seen the sector as a threat, cutting into its market share, both in the flow of hard currency and in the wholesale markets. So they have pushed to keep this sector restricted. We haven't seen new small and medium-sized enterprises after a flurry of almost 11,000, of over 11,000 of them being approved between 2021 and 2024. We haven't seen any really approved since. So there's still areas where the military where Gaesa and other state-owned enterprises run the show, where the private sector isn't really a force yet. Hopefully that'll change. Healthcare supply chains is one of those. Large-scale food production on the ground. So even though it's importing much of the food, producing the food on the ground in Cuba remains a constraint. Right now, Cuba has to import upwards of 80% of its food needs in a country that has very fertile land, and nonetheless it's incapable of growing its food. And as we mentioned earlier, larger energy infrastructure because, fuel handles some of the needs, energy needs on the island, but that doesn't run the thermoelectric plants that run on crude oil. And of course, anything, as I mentioned before, requiring foreign investment. So again, part of the solution, but far short from being the whole solution.
Thank you, Rick. Marta, in your opening comments, you talked about the activities that you've been involved in. And you listened to what Mark and Rick has talked about the obstacles, the constraints to the private sector. What is your sense of how, I won't use the word larger, but how much more capacity do you think the private sector has in Cuba to get more engaged and get active in the kinds of issues that we're talking about today?
Yes. Well, I think we can do much more, definitely, but we have big challenges. I think Rick also mentioned the banking sector. I mean, all the banking is a big problem here because we need to use legal structures and banking structures outside of Cuba to pay and to receive money as well, dollars, because now we are not able to receive it in our bank accounts in Cuba. So definitely that financing in general, I mean, the Vice Oscar Perez Oliva's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spoke about the investment in Cuban companies, in Cuban private companies through, I mean, this legal structure with foreign companies investing in private companies. But this is not, so he spoke about it, it seems like they're going to allow it, but it's not a way. I mean, in matters, there is not a system or a path or how we can do it right now. Because we can do much more things that we are doing it, but without a banking system is very complicated. Of course, there are all the reasons. Since 2024, the government had been controlling or much more the process of how a MIPYME is approved. So usually before May 2024, there were like 100 MIPYMEs approved per week, or 200, or even 300 in some point. But since that point, there is like 360, something like that, in almost 2 years. So, and we need more companies doing things. We need more people. For example, there are now, with this maybe possible opening in the economy and possible changes in Cuba, there are many Cuban Americans and Cubans abroad that they want to open their companies in Cuba. But the reality is the government is not approving those, I mean, any company, not those companies in particular, any company. So the process is really, is almost a year or more. So there are many reasons the bank in the process to approve of course there are another situation that you can organize, like myself, for example. I can organize my company with solar panels, with the electric vehicles to provide the service. But if the people can't connect, in their own houses, I have the same problems. So it's how, in some points, say, Rick, we can do a lot of things, but we can do everything because there are some monopolies like Texas, like the Unión Eléctrica de Cuba. They are controlled by the government, and we don't have access to it. But definitely, we are I mean, we have a very important role in bringing food. And for example, if now if in my area, in my municipality, even if my street where I have my companies, there is a problem, we fix it. There are many private companies fixing the problems of their communities because the government is not able to do it. So there are many private companies doing it. And we are helping and doing a lot of social projects to help, but we have a lot of limitations and in licenses and in financing, definitely.
Thank you, Marta. So I guess what we're all saying now is if there were access to financing, things might look a little different right now. And we know that, well, let's not assume we know. Let's ask maybe the disingenuous question, why isn't there more access to financing? Okay, what on the US side in terms of regulatory constraints, and what on the Cuban side in terms of, as Rick just had mentioned, the leeriness which Gaesa might look at the private sector in the non-Gaesa private sector in Cuba might be getting too big and almost challenging to the business interests of Gaesa. Mark, why don't you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. I think there's, as always in Cuba, there's a couple of pieces happening simultaneously. To disentangle slightly, in my mind anyway, on the US side, I think one of the, and because to Rick's point, there are, now regulatory provisions where US banks can actually, the Cuban private sector company could open hypothetically a bank account, et cetera, et cetera. The truth is that the kind of, the distrust in the banking sector of the reliability of the enforcement mechanisms around the sanctions are such that it's from when you have compliance officers and lawyers, et cetera, it's not worth the risk because they literally don't trust that if they did something, they wouldn't be whacked down for it at some point now or later. So they basically don't do anything. Degree to which we can deal with that would be very, very helpful, obviously. And it would focus on the United States simply because it's, well, for many reasons, but partly because it's such a huge market. It's like right there and 90 miles away. On the Cuban side, my own personal view is obviously the Cubans could do a lot more to improve the regulatory framework for the to the SME sector. They could approve faster. They could attempt to strip away unnecessary regulatory burden. Absolutely, 100%. They should do that. Stepping again back a little bit and maybe coming at it from a slightly different kind of government public policy perspective. All private sector companies hate government regulation in any country. Just listen to Canadian companies. It's an issue. Leave us alone. Let us go about our business and make our money. In Cuba, my view is that we have to sort of strip away some of the old narrative that it's somehow a completely unique, bizarre, almost alien being in terms of public policy and governance. And it's a country with a government and a government structure and policy. So I think one of the things that has happened and that we can, we being the global community could help work with the Cubans potentially on this kind of thing is they have become worried over time that not all SMEs are created equal. There is a politics to the SME sector that needs to be managed. Ironically, in earlier stages, there were public complaints quite vociferous about price gouging, not by Marta, of course, but by certain private sector companies because they're supplying commodities and goods that are in great scarcity. So there are issues around, the concept of government price control and that kind of thing, which becomes again very problematic. And then there's the taxation issues. Because what the SME sector has done, and bravo, because they're highly entrepreneurial, has worked very creative structures around having to, finding ways to finance themselves because banks won't finance them up from the outside. Private investment capital hasn't flowed to them, although that's something we should all work on. So they've worked out some very interesting ways of doing things. And if you're sitting in the tax department in the Cuban government, you're saying, well, wait a second, we got to make sure that that there's not loopholes and that they're being plugged the same way that any public policy would be run anywhere in the world. So I'm just saying that there's an intersection here of policy requirements and regulation that goes beyond kind of kind of an evil control impulse. It's government regulation of a sector so that it's done properly. But at the same time, making sure that it's not onerous and it doesn't get out of control, it doesn't become a monstrous, labyrinth, and making it as easy as possible for the SMEs to operate.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, Rick, here you go. Open field running for you. Take your crack at it. Can at least in the short term or short to medium term, can there be some alleviation? Again, going back to the main topic of the humanitarian crisis, we're actually, of course, talking about then what could be beyond that. Is this a matter of a few strokes of the pen on the island and 90 miles away? Is this something that at least that certain measures could be taken to release the kind of funding or to release the other kinds of mechanisms that would allow the private sector to grow in Cuba and to fulfill a broader mandate, social mandate?
Sure. Oh yeah, there's much that can happen. I think Mark explained it well, but I'll just add some color to his remarks. What we have is an excess of government law and regulation from both sides that needs to be untangled. And in some cases, there's the will to untangle, but it's really hard to do because it requires changes in the law. And in other cases, they've just been reluctant to touch certain elements of this. On the Cuban side, there's much that the Cuban government could do to help unleash the potential of the sector. They can authorize direct foreign investment into private sector businesses. It's something that hasn't been authorized yet. There
Yes.
was an announcement last week that they would allow Cubans abroad to invest in private sector businesses, but according to the current foreign investment law, which still requires that every investment be authorized by the government, and the government tends to slow roll, if not outright stall, those investments into its own state enterprises. Imagine how slow that could be. That process will end up being for private enterprises that are independent of the government. So certainly, passing clear laws that would authorize for direct foreign investment, make it clear the types of financing that Cuban private businesses can accept. Right now, the current law is interpreted as allowing them to accept loans and to operate on loans, but it could be clearer. There's still restrictions around that. They could give the sector access to a foreign currency exchange market. They still don't have access to a foreign currency exchange market. So much of, whenever they sell in pesos, the private sector does anything they sell in pesos on the ground, they need to then exchange for dollars or euros so that they can pay foreign suppliers and bring in the next shipment of goods. So these are all things that the Cuban government could do tomorrow to help unleash this potential. And then there's one basic thing that is probably easier than any of the ones I just mentioned that they could do right away is issue a public corporate registry of the private sector. Right now, even if you had a bank in the United States that read the US regulation said, okay, it says here I can open accounts to Marta. I want to go ahead and open up an account for Marta. How do I verify that Marta's business in Cuba is indeed a business incorporated in Cuba and whose its directors and officers are? There is no public corporate registry in Cuba. That would help, right? Because that would allow the compliance department to run their KYC review and see, okay, these are the beneficiaries of this business. These are the officers, directors. We have a sense for who they actually are, and we'll go ahead and open up this bank account. On the U.S. side, and which also impacts global banking because global banking has become increasingly intertwined, international, and there's always for most banks, if there isn't a U.S. nexus yet, they're going in that direction through mergers, acquisitions, et cetera. And so anything that's going to put them in the crosshairs of U.S. secondary sanctions, they just don't want to deal with. And this is why they've largely shut out the Cuban market. But clearer guidance as to what are the due diligence standards that are required by by U.S. Treasury to um, to onboard this sector. That alone could also help go a long way. But if I were to put it on one thing that could potentially be enough for any one player out there already looking at the space is that corporate registry that would need to be published on the Cuban side.
Fair enough, Ricky. Just one quick follow-up, if I understood you correctly, and then I absolutely want to hear from Marta on this, is even if the Cuban government were to do the things that you talked about, is there still not, without some action in the U.S., that grave doubt that Mark talked about, that sooner or later they're going to get in some political scenario in the U.S. or enforcement scenario in the U.S., they're going to get caught up as having violated some aspect of U.S. law, right? In other words, if I understood what Mark's thinks, the Cuban government can do all of that, but it's still going to be, and there could be even money flowing in and et cetera, but there's still going to be that overhanging thing. Do we want to potentially risk ourselves vis-a-vis the U.S. government? Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that remains a challenge. However, it's evolving. And here's the thing. It goes back to my earlier point of an excess of law and regulation. Um, the U.S. embargo on Cuba is largely codified under a series of laws that were passed in the 1990s up until 2000. Right. At that time, particularly the key law here, which is the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, that codifies the bulk of U.S. sanctions, but it also codifies the president's authority to issue all sorts of exceptions through specific and general licenses in order to help support the Cuban people, since support for the Cuban people is one of the two core pillars of U.S. policy. It's keeping the pressure on the government, but also increasing support for the people. They never contemplated that there could be a private sector in Cuba under single party communist control. So the law is interpreted often, up until now, has been interpreted in a very conservative way by Office of Legal Counsel in successive White Houses going back to Obama as being restrictive. So that means that even though the law doesn't address a private sector in Cuba, the law does not open up financing, does not authorize. If you open up financing to private businesses in Cuba, you run the risk of running up against the restrictions of that law. All the regulations that were enacted during the Obama years and were kept in place during Trump 1, Biden, and now in Trump 2, are done through general licenses. And then there's also trade that can be done through specific licenses. Without getting too technical here, the concern has been is that, well, okay, so you have a Democratic administration, they have a more lenient engagement leaning approach to Cuba. They support the private sector. We open up, even though the law says that it's restrictive. These exceptions says it's authorized. We take the risk. What happens when the Republicans take over and you have more hawkish people running foreign policy? Then, because of that and the lack of that sort of long-term legal clarity and the size of the Cuban market, most banks say, why bother? It's not worth our trouble. It's not worth us taking on all these compliance costs. What is really interesting about the moment is that as of February, we have Secretary of State, Cuban American from Miami, lifelong Cuba hawk, that has basically made it clear that they see the private sector as a key strategic partner on the ground to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is basically endorsing the existence of the private sector and seeing it as a force for good and for helping alleviate this crisis and help empower the right people in Cuba. So that should help to reduce the political uncertainty, right? The perceived political risk here, because you now have, in essence, a bipartisan consensus that's pretty clear that we see the private sector in Cuba as a good thing and something that the United States, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, wants to support. Now, there's always some of the voices in Miami that tend to take maximalist positions on this. They've been calling all along for shutting down all licenses and trade with the private sector. We haven't seen it reflected in policy, regardless of who's in the White House, dating back to Obama. And now that Rubio, also from Miami, has endorsed the sector, it's hard to ever see us going back to it. So is there still a risk as long as the law that codifies these sanctions is in place? Yes. But I would argue that that risk is now lesser than it was, say, back in December.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Marta, you've been listening to a lot of this conversation patiently. I guess the first question is, based on what you've heard from Mark and Rick about the constraints on the private sector, some of which you talked about earlier, where do you see the potential for being able to expand what you do? And with the entrepreneurs that you work with and that you know on the ground, like what do you think is the main issue that's holding things back, besides the financing, as we talked about?
Sorry, Kenneth, I lost you. The connection just free, and I didn't hear the question.
Oh, fine. Yeah. No, I mean, what I was saying was, Mark and Rick were talking about the constraints on the U.S. side for expanding the private sector, and then a bit on the Cuban side as well. You talked about earlier the fundamental need for financing. Are there other issues that you think could free, as it were, the private sector to expand and take on a greater role?
Yeah, I think I understood you because the connection is a little bit
Yeah, no, we appreciate we
worse.
appreciate your work. You're working under not easy conditions, so thank you for that.
No, it's okay. Es que Zoom is blocked in Cuba, so this is part of the challenges that we have, and we have to use VPN to connect to these apps, and having the technological company that we develop our app. It's I mean, we have these challenges all the time. I mean, I think of course there are many things that the Cuban government, also the U.S. government can do to help the private sector. I was, I was very happy when I saw the government, this second Trump started talking about private sector, because for many for a long time, some people have said the private sector in Cuba doesn't exist, and all the companies belong to the government, and that was something also that it was like a lot of Cuban in Miami share that thought, and I was very happy that they recognized, right? And this, I always say that it's a matter of logic. I mean, there are 9,000 MIPYMEs. If there were not this, and since 2024. Only have been approved like 300, but only my office have like 20 MIPYMEs waiting for being approved, and there are many other companies that help to prepare all the paperwork. So there are many people waiting to present their projects to be approved as a company. So there, maybe you can have a percentage of that amount of people that represent almost the in general, the private sector, 40% of the working population, but it can be everyone. So that's a good sign. I think we are in a good moment in both sides to speak about private sector and what are the things that they can do. Of course, all the limitations that we have to get access to internet tools that it makes us really difficult. Of course, I mean, you can imagine last year I had 5 bank accounts that they were closed only for have any relation with Cuba, or they imagine that how we have a relation in Cuba. So there is an over compliance in all the bank that is killing us. It's really difficult to work like this. And of course, inside of Cuba, the Cuban government have to, I mean, have to open to more financials structures, alternative financial structure, because in some point maybe a big commercial bank can be here, but it's the banking is a huge problem that we face, and exchange rate in general. I mean, we can buy dollars in Cuba to pay our suppliers. We have to do it abroad, or many pymes that they receive the national currency here do it through the black market, and of course access to capital, that the investment funds that can come, or a company or a friend or a family, and that we can provide, if they're not Cuban, that we can provide them guarantees that they can invest in our businesses. That could be really helpful, and that's something also that needs to be talked maybe in both sides, and in Cuba to make it easier, all the process, and also in United States to make maybe to give confidence to investors that they can invest in Cuba, and where the ways to do it. But I think in general that could be really helpful, because there are many ways now that we can import our diesel, that the government allow us to do it. Also, the U.S. government do it for the private sector. So that give you a kind of independence to work. So that's really positive. And on the internet, there are ways to, if you have solar partners, you have this, you can continue working. So there are ways, but of course you need all the approvals and the licenses and the money to do it. But I think that's a good moment, because our government is talking about private sector in a positive way, and also the U.S. government is talking about us like we exist. So I think we have a point in common there, and I'm positive in that way.
Thank you, Marta. I haven't left a lot of time, but maybe we'll go over a minute or two if possible. There are two other actors writ large, at least, that we can talk about. In some quarters, the idea is, well, if you want to help the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, almost, I think in some cases it's even painted as an either or. Well, just make contributions to the Catholic Church and Caritas. What is the role? And I have to ask for quick responses to this, because then I want to get to the role of international states and other actors, and doing this particularly take advantage of Mark being on the panel from a Canadian point of view. What is the role of the Catholic Church, Caritas and the like, in helping this alleviate a bit of this humanitarian crisis, and what the relationship, what are there gaps between what the church can do and what private sector could do, et cetera, et cetera. Rick, do you want to take a quick shot at that?
Sure. Before I do, I wanted to note real quick that the reason why Zoom is blocked in Cuba is not because the Cuban government blocks it. It's self-blocked because Zoom is over complying with Cuban law. because they can't verify that the end user in their cloud-based, fee-based service, because you have to pay for Zoom, is not some entity or individual that's under sanctions under U.S. law. They just shut out the market entirely. And that is the reason why Marta's having such a hard time today. As far as the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church and other religious NGOs on the ground, um, they really serve as the one truly independent, largest independent institution outside of the Cuban government on the island today, and one that has some capacity, already had capacity in place to help receive humanitarian aid, warehouse the aid, and distribute it to all sorts of to provinces throughout the country, to mess halls to feed the elderly, and to other places to reach to those that are most needed. So the United States government quickly identified the church as a partner to work with in delivering humanitarian aid to Cuba. That first happened after Hurricane Melissa last fall, that we started that this administration pledged $3 million in humanitarian aid that would be distributed through the church, and then has pledged another $6 million. Now on the ground, while they do have that capacity, sort of that supply chain infrastructure in place, it is limited. And what we're seeing is that the church and other church affiliated groups, like, let's say, Friends of Caritas Cuba, who is not receiving that aid that is provided by the U.S. government, but has been conducting its own donation campaigns and delivering its own goods to those most in need in Cuba, are contracting with private sector businesses to help receive that food in ports, to transport it in privately owned trucks to warehouses and to other storage facilities, or to places where it will ultimately be distributed. They're also increasingly relying on the capacity of those existing private sector businesses that are importing goods and importing other household staples to purchase those goods from those private businesses to then distribute it to the elderly, marginalized groups, others that are most in need. So they're on the ground. They're active. I'm hearing more and more of these, not just the church, Caritas, Friends of Caritas, and others that are on the ground are working, are working more and more with the private sector. They also end up facing many of the same constraints that the private sector has. Getting payments down to these organizations on the ground is very difficult. Even the church, which making payments through, if you're going to make a payment through the Vatican or anything that's tied to the Cuban banking system, you're pegged with the official exchange rate, which is far less appealing than the street rate, which is the one that the private sector uses. So that's just to give an example. But they're active, limited, but a key player in all this.
Thanks, Rick. Marta, do you want to talk a bit about the role of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis the private sector?
Yes, yes, very quick. I mean, they're playing a big role because they have, in some point, I mean, they have all, I mean, they have been helping the people. That is the most important. For many years, they have the church where the people goes and they know they can find help there, and also they have more or less a way, like it's like the government recognize that they can do that work. And but for themselves, most of them, I mean, they don't have the logistics to deliver the food, or to import the legal structure, how to get the diesel, all these things. And so most of them work with the private sector to do that. So I've been working now for a while, also with the War Central Kitchen when they came also to Cuba. when different hurricanes has happened, and we have been collaborating, and I really loved it because it's a way to, of course, to help my people in Cuba, and they do a fantastic and an amazing job because they really go to almost every corner in the island, and they have people all around.
Thanks, Marta. Mark, I'll give you a few seconds if you want to add on to that, but I did in the remaining borrowed time that we have now. I want to just move into the role of international, states and what they might be able to do. And let's just, and maybe I'll then end with Rick after I come to Mark on this, is as we discussed in the last episode of this series, Canadian government has had a relationship with a non-interrupted relationship with Cuba, waning in the last number of years, but still a presence. You want to talk a little bit about what Canada traditionally might have done in this situation, and what it's doing, or as far as you can discern what it's doing, might be affected by the dynamic that's playing out now between Canada and the U.S.
Sure. I mean, in a nutshell, Canada has maintained a relationship for decades and decades, as you mentioned, Ken. We're still there. We've always been there. I think in normal course, in a kind of a humanitarian situation like this, and it would be very much calibrated to the degree of severity of the crisis, you would probably see a similar amount of humanitarian aid, but you'd see the Canadian Embassy on the ground a lot more active. You might see greater use of Canadian instruments of support to Canadian business, for example. You might see work with the private sector in Cuba more active because the embassy would be more active. There'd be a kind of a greater presence, and there'd be more public, potentially more public commentary on the situation in Cuba. From my feel, let's put it that way, in sense, and I have lots of friends still in the Canadian government and the Foreign Service, etc.
Ottawa's a small town, Mark. You know that.
My personal impression is that you won't see much more from the government of Mark Carney on Cuba at this moment, subject to whether or not the humanitarian situation becomes even worse than it is. And it's bad now, but you probably won't see any worse because the Prime Minister is laser focused, on a number of priorities for the country. Most of them are related to trade diversification. Number one, getting a renegotiated trilateral North American free trade deal done with the United States and Mexico, known as CUSMA in Canada, USMCA in the United States. That will be very problematic. It will be a virtual gong show. I think the Prime Minister is very focused on that because of the importance to Canadian economy of the relationship with the United States. So, doesn't want to pursue distractions. Although he's also, at the same time, been very focused on trade diversification away from historic reliance on the United States because the days of complacency are over. This is the official kind of view in Ottawa. And he's been very explicit about the priorities for the country. And these are relationships with the European Union, the UK, India, to some degree, China, much less with Latin America, and even less as a priority foreign policy issue, Cuba. That could change, depending on public pressures and public opinion. I don't think the government of Canada will move in an active way on Cuba in the near future.
Thanks, Mark. Rick, I'll give you the last word. You heard a bit about one potential foreign actor, what role they might, or at this point, it seems won't take actively anyway. What would you recommend to other foreign actors as a way that they could get engaged in this issue, given that they all are a bit of a tightrope walking their relationship with Washington?
I would say if the relationship with Washington is a concern, which understandably it is, just look at the policy. Look what's being authorized. If you already are a country that has good relations with Cuba, embassy on the ground, engage more with this private sector. We're seeing the Canadian embassy in Cuba and other Western embassies increasing their engagement with the private sector, Latin American embassies as well to some extent. I would say enhance that engagement, work more closely with this private sector, help identify foreign suppliers of the kinds of wares and goods and food that they're looking to import. And if you can find a bank that can read the tea leaves right now, and when it comes to extending banking to this sector, understand that obviously everybody's going to run their own risk assessment, but the position of the United States has been and remains favorable towards offering banking to this sector, and to help provide exports of all sorts of goods to this sector. So I would encourage other Western countries in particular, I would imagine, given our audience, to work with their own respective private sectors to look for how we can strengthen ties with the private sector on the ground in Cuba. It shouldn't just be through the United States.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks so much, Rick. I also want to thank Mark and particularly Marta for joining us today, for
Yes.
all of the efforts that you did, Marta, to be able to join us today. So thank you for that. We would like to invite you all to follow us on social media to stay informed about upcoming CCA events and programming, including our recently launched report, Beyond the Build, a new Canadian strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. And also to remind everyone that the videos of today's event in English, French, and Spanish will be available on our website, ccacanada.com. Thank you all again. Thanks for sticking with us through this hour. And Rick, Mark, and Marta, and Ken will be coming back to you again for further sessions on Cuba and the crisis there right now. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye
all.
bye.
Bye bye.
All
Ciao.
success to Marta.
Yeah.
Much success.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
We
eres la
will
heroína.
success.
Eres la
We will
heroína
su-
hoy, Marta.
We
Ciao,
will
ciao.
success. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.